The lone figure of Zane Blackwood cut a stark silhouette against the setting sun as he surveyed the vast expanse of Wyoming Territory, 1878. The golden light caught in his dark hair and illuminated the lines etched into his face lines that spoke of hardship and loss beyond his 30 years. He had learned early that a man riding the untamed frontier had no business dreaming of hearth and home. That was a truth branded onto his soul just as surely as his cattle bore his mark. "Come on, boy," he murmured to his stallion, adjusting his weathered Stetson. "Let's get back before dark." The horse snorted in agreement as Zane turned toward the distant lights of Redemption Creek. The small town had grown considerably since he'd first arrived 5 years ago with nothing but determination and the skills he'd learned working other men's ranches. Now the Double B spread was his own 500 acres of the finest grazing land in the territory, won through sweat and stubborn persistence. But despite his success, Zane returned each night to an empty ranch house. No wife waited at the door. No children's laughter filled the rooms. Just silence and memories of the family he'd lost as a boy, memories that taught him love was a luxury a man in his position couldn't afford. The horses' hooves kicked up dust as they made their way down the main street. Redemption Creek was alive with the usual evening bustle, miners and cowboys fresh off shift, looking to wash away the day's toil with whiskey and cards. The Golden Nugget Saloon's piano music spilled into the street, along with raucous laughter and the occasional curse. "Mr. Blackwood." Sheriff Tom Jenkins nodded as Zane passed. "Heard you might be hiring for the spring drive." "That's right, need a few good men who know cattle." Zane slowed his horse. "You know anybody?" Matter of fact, the stage brought in some newcomers today. "One fella claimed to have worked the Kishome Trail last season. Might be worth talking to." "I'll keep that in mind." Zane tipped his hat and was about to continue when a commotion further down the street caught his attention. A stagecoach had pulled up outside the Grand Hotel, and a small crowd had gathered to watch the passengers disembark. Zane wouldn't have given it a second glance, except for the woman who stepped down last, even from a distance. Something about her commanded attention. She wore a practical traveling dress of deep blue, and when she removed her bonnet to look around, her hair caught the last light of day, the rich auburn color of autumn leaves. There was a quiet dignity in the way she stood, taking in her surroundings with a measured gaze rather than the wide-eyed alarm most Eastern women displayed upon arriving in a frontier town. "That's the new schoolteacher," Jenkins offered, following Zane's gaze. "Miss Rose or Ross?" "Something like that. Town council's been corresponding with her for months. Supposed to be starting up the school again come Monday." Zane grunted in acknowledgement, but couldn't tear his eyes away as the woman directed the hotel porter regarding her trunks. There was something both graceful and determined in her movements. "Well, good night, Sheriff," Zane finally said, nudging his horse forward. "Night, Blackwood. Think about what I said about that cowhand." Zane nodded, but his thoughts had already drifted elsewhere. He wasn't sure why the sight of the new schoolteacher had captured his attention so thoroughly. Perhaps it was simply the novelty of a new face in their small community. Whatever the reason, he pushed the woman from his mind as he rode out of town toward his ranch. A schoolteacher from back east would have no place in his world of cattle, dust, and endless work. Besides, he reminded himself, he'd sealed off that part of his heart long ago, after watching his mother wither away from grief when his father was killed by rustlers. Love was for men who could afford to be vulnerable. And Zane Blackwood had learned the hard way that vulnerability was a luxury he couldn't afford. Ruby Sullivan stared at the ceiling of her room at the Grand Hotel, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of Redemption Creek at night. Though exhausted from the grueling stagecoach journey, sleep eluded her. The adventure she had embarked upon, leaving behind everything familiar in Boston to take a teaching position in Wyoming Territory, suddenly seemed terrifyingly real. 26 years old and unmarried, Ruby had scandalized her family by accepting the position. "A proper lady does not venture alone into the wilderness," her mother had protested. But after nursing her father through his final illness and watching her younger sisters marry and start families of their own, Ruby had felt suffocated by the narrow confines of her expected path. Teaching had always been her passion, and when the letter came from the Redemption Creek Town Council, it had seemed like providence. They needed an educated woman to reopen their school, which had been closed for nearly a year since the previous teacher had left to marry. The salary they offered was modest, but included accommodations in a small cottage behind the schoolhouse. Ruby sat up and lit the lamp beside her bed. Dawn was still hours away, but her mind was too active for sleep. She pulled out the small leather journal she had brought with her and began to write. First impressions of Redemption Creek, smaller than I imagined, yet somehow larger in spirit. The people seemed direct but not unfriendly. The town itself sits in a valley surrounded by the most magnificent mountains I have ever seen. She continued writing until her eyelids grew heavy. Tomorrow would be her first full day in her new home. The school term wouldn't begin until Monday, giving her 3 days to prepare the schoolhouse and familiarize herself with the town. Just as she was drifting off to sleep, Ruby remembered the man she had glimpsed upon arriving, tall and broad-shouldered atop a magnificent black horse, watching her with an intensity that had made her breath catch. Even from a distance, there had been something compelling about him, a stillness, a self-contained strength. She wondered fleetingly who he was before sleep finally claimed her. The next morning dawned clear and crisp. Ruby dressed carefully in one of her plainer dresses, a sensible gray wool with minimal trimming, and ventured downstairs for breakfast. The hotel dining room was nearly empty at this early hour. The only other patrons were an elderly couple and a man in a suit who appeared to be a traveling salesman. Ruby took a seat by the window where she could observe the town coming to life. "Coffee, miss?" a waitress approached with a pot. "Yes, please, and whatever breakfast you recommend. Flapjacks are good. Cook makes 'em with buttermilk." "That sounds perfect." As the waitress departed, the door to the dining room opened, and the sheriff Ruby had met briefly upon her arrival entered. Upon seeing her, he removed his hat and approached. "Miss Sullivan, good morning. I trust you slept well after your journey." "Good morning, Sheriff Jenkins." "Yes, thank you, though I admit everything is still quite new and different." "I imagine so." He smiled kindly. "I was wondering if you might like a proper tour of our little town this morning. The schoolhouse should be unlocked for you to inspect, and I'd be happy to introduce you to some of the families whose children will be in your care." "That's very kind of you," Ruby said, genuinely touched by the offer. "I would appreciate that greatly." "Excellent. I'll return in an hour if that suits." After a hearty breakfast, Ruby collected her shawl and reticule and met Sheriff Jenkins outside the hotel. The morning air was brisk but refreshing, and Ruby found herself energized by the clear mountain atmosphere. Jenkins proved to be an informative guide, pointing out not only the obvious establishments, the general store, the telegraph office, the bank, but also sharing tidbits about the people who operated them. "And this here's the schoolhouse," he said at last, stopping before a modest white clapboard building set back from the main street. "It's not much to look at, but it's solid. The town council had it whitewashed fresh for your arrival." Ruby approached the building with anticipation. It was indeed simple, a single-room structure with a small bell tower, but well-constructed and meticulously maintained. Large windows would provide ample light, and a wood stove in the center would keep the space warm during the harsh winter months. "It's perfect," she said sincerely. "Your living quarters are just behind." Jenkins led her around to a small cottage attached to the rear of the schoolhouse. 2 rooms, bedroom, and a kitchen. There's a pump out back for water, privies there too. The cottage was even more modest than the schoolhouse, but Ruby found it charming. After the crowded family home in Boston, the idea of having her own space, however small, was appealing. The town council arranged for some basic furnishings, Jenkins continued, unlocking the door. Bed, table, couple of chairs. Anything else you need, Harmon at the general store can order it for you. Ruby stepped inside. A narrow bed occupied one corner, a small table with two wooden chairs another. A cast-iron cookstove dominated the kitchen area. Simple shelves lined one wall and a colorful braided rug covered part of the plank floor. "This will do nicely," she said, running her hand along the table's smooth surface. "When can I move in? Today, if you like. I'll arrange for your trunks to be brought over from the hotel." Ruby spent the remainder of the morning exploring her new home and the schoolhouse, making lists of supplies she would need and cleaning the already tidy spaces to her satisfaction. By afternoon, her trunks had arrived, and she set about unpacking her modest possessions. As she arranged her books on the shelf, treasured volumes of Shakespeare, Dickens, and Emerson, alongside practical texts on arithmetic, grammar, and history, Ruby felt a surge of confidence. This was right. This was where she was meant to be. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Expecting Sheriff Jenkins returning to check on her, Ruby was surprised to find a woman approximately her own age standing on the threshold, holding a covered basket. "Miss Sullivan, I'm Harriet Wheeler, the doctor's wife. I thought you might appreciate a home-cooked meal after your long journey and busy day. How thoughtful. Please come in." Harriet proved to be friendly and talkative, providing Ruby with a wealth of information about the town and its inhabitants as they shared the meal. She had brought fried chicken, biscuits, and apple pie. "Most of the children are good students," Harriet assured her, "though you'll have your hands full with the Donovan boys. Wild as March hares, those two, but smart as whips when they apply themselves." "How many students should I expect?" "Around 20, ranging from 6 to 14. Some of the ranch children might only attend sporadically, especially during busy seasons." "Ranch children?" "Yes, from the surrounding cattle operations. The Petersons, the Millers, and of course the Blackwood children." "Blackwood?" Ruby asked, the name triggering a memory. "Is their father a tall man with dark hair, rides a black horse?" Harriet laughed. "That sounds like Zane Blackwood, but he has no children, no wife either, though not for lack of interested parties." She leaned forward conspiratorially. "He owns the largest ranch in the area, the Double B. Built it up from nothing, they say. He's reserved, keeps to himself mostly except for business. He's on the town council, though, so you'll likely meet him soon enough." Ruby found herself inexplicably intrigued by this description. "Why no wife? Is he very young? Around 30, I'd guess." "There are rumors. Of course, some tragic lost love in his past, or perhaps he's simply married to his work. He's polite but distant with most folks." The conversation moved on to other topics, but Ruby found herself returning to thoughts of the mysterious rancher as she prepared for bed that night. There was something compelling about the image Harriet had painted: a solitary, successful man who had deliberately chosen isolation. So different from the eager young men of Boston society who had courted her with predictable compliments and transparent ambitions. Not that Ruby had much experience with suitors. Her years caring for her father had limited her social opportunities, and by the time she was free to consider marriage, she found herself out of step with her peers, more interested in books and ideas than in hosting dinner parties or discussing the latest fashions. Ruby extinguished her lamp and settled under the unfamiliar blankets. Tomorrow she would continue preparing for the school term, perhaps meet some of her future students and their parents. The thought filled her with purpose. Whatever mysteries Redemption Creek held, including the enigmatic Zane Blackwood, could wait. She had come here to teach, and that would be her focus. Zane's mood darkened as he rode toward town for the monthly town council meeting. Spring calving was in full swing, and he could ill afford to be away from the ranch, even for a few hours. But as one of the founding members of the council, he took his responsibilities seriously. As he approached the outskirts of Redemption Creek, he noticed activity around the schoolhouse that had stood empty for months. A slender figure in a plain dress was sweeping the front steps energetically. Even from a distance, he recognized the new schoolteacher. Without consciously deciding to, Zane found himself turning his horse toward the schoolhouse. He told himself he was merely being neighborly, welcoming a newcomer as any decent citizen would. The woman looked up as he approached, shading her eyes against the morning sun. Up close, Zane was struck by the vivid green of her eyes, clear and direct, meeting his gaze without artifice or coquetry. "Good morning," she said, her voice carrying a hint of an Eastern accent. "Can I help you?" Zane removed his hat. "Just thought I'd introduce myself, madam, Zane Blackwood. I own the Double B Ranch outside of town. Ruby Sullivan." She offered her hand with a frankness that surprised him. The new schoolteacher, though I suppose everyone knows that by now. Her handshake was firm, her hand small but capable looking, with a writer's callus on one finger. Not soft and pampered like most Eastern ladies. "How are you finding Redemption Creek, Miss Sullivan?" "Quite well, thank you. Everyone has been very welcoming. I'm just preparing for classes to begin on Monday. I understand you'll have students from some of the outlying ranches, so I'm told." "Will there be children from your ranch attending, Mr. Blackwood?" "No children at the Double B," he said, more curtly than he'd intended. "Just me and my ranch hands." Something flickered across her face, curiosity perhaps, but she merely nodded. "I see. Well, I won't keep you. I'm sure you have business in town." "Town council meeting," he confirmed, settling his hat back on his head. "Welcome to Redemption Creek, Miss Sullivan." "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood." As he rode away, Zane found himself dwelling on the brief encounter. There was something refreshing about Miss Sullivan's straightforward manner, no simpering or batting of eyelashes as he'd come to expect from unmarried women. Just a clear gaze and intelligent conversation, not that it mattered. The last thing he needed was to be distracted by a schoolteacher, however intriguing. He had a ranch to run and responsibilities that left no room for personal entanglements. The town council meeting was already underway when Zane entered the room above the bank that served as their meeting space. Mayor Harrison, owner of the general store, nodded in acknowledgement as Zane took his seat. "Now that we're all here," Harrison said, "let's discuss the matter of the spring festival. With the school reopening, it seems an appropriate time to revive the tradition." The discussion meandered through various proposals for activities, budget considerations, and logistics. Zane contributed little, his mind repeatedly drifting to the encounter with Miss Sullivan. "What do you think, Blackwood?" Harrison's question snapped him back to attention. "About what?" "Holding the festival on your property, as we did 3 years ago. Your meadow by the creek is ideal and centrally located for town and ranch families alike." Zane hesitated. Hosting the festival meant opening his land to the entire community, something he generally avoided. But he recognized the practical advantages of the location. "Fine," he agreed reluctantly, "but I'll need help with setup and cleanup. Can't spare my men from their regular duties." "Of course," Harrison agreed readily. "We'll form a committee." "And speaking of committees, we should formally welcome our new schoolteacher. I propose a small reception after church on Sunday, nothing elaborate, just coffee and cake to let Miss Sullivan meet the parents." The motion was approved unanimously, and the meeting moved on to other business. By the time it concluded, Zane was impatient to return to his ranch. He declined an invitation to join the other council members for lunch at the hotel dining room, citing the need to check on a pregnant heifer. As he rode out of town, he deliberately avoided passing the schoolhouse again. The following days passed in a blur of activity for both Zane and Ruby, each absorbed in their respective responsibilities. While Ruby meticulously prepared lesson plans and arranged her classroom, Zane dealt with the challenges of spring, having seasoned sleepless nights checking heifers, the constant vigilance required to protect vulnerable newborns from predators, and the myriad other tasks that consumed a rancher's life in spring. Sunday arrived with clear skies and mild temperatures. Ruby had attended church services her first Sunday in town, but had slipped away quickly afterward, eager to complete her preparations for the start of school. This week, however, Sheriff Jenkins had specifically mentioned the reception being held in her honor, making attendance obligatory. The small white church was filled to capacity, with families from town and surrounding ranches packed into the pews. Ruby, seated near the front with Harriet Wheeler and her husband, was acutely aware of curious glances directed her way. As the congregation rose for the final hymn, Ruby's gaze drifted toward the back of the church. There, standing at least a head taller than those around him, was Zane Blackwood. Their eyes met briefly before he looked away, his expression unreadable. Following the service, the congregation gathered in the church hall for the reception. Ruby found herself surrounded by parents eager to introduce themselves and their children. She did her best to memorize names and faces, responding warmly to their welcome while inwardly feeling overwhelmed by the barrage of new acquaintances. "Miss Sullivan." Mayor Harrison approached, leading a reluctant-looking Zane Blackwood. "I wanted to officially introduce you to one of our town council members, Mr. Zane Blackwood." "We've met briefly," Ruby said with a smile, "though I appreciate the formal introduction. Blackwood has generously offered his property for our spring festival next month," Harrison continued. "It's become something of a tradition in Redemption Creek games for the children, a community meal, dancing in the evening." "That sounds lovely," Ruby said. "Will your students be performing, Miss Sullivan? The previous teacher always had them recite poetry or perform a short play." "I hadn't considered it," Ruby admitted. "But it's an excellent idea, perhaps once I've had a chance to assess their abilities." "Splendid," Harrison beamed. "I'll leave you two to get acquainted. Miss Sullivan, we're all delighted to have you with us." As the mayor moved away to greet other parishioners, an awkward silence fell between Ruby and Zane. He seemed tense, as if eager to escape but constrained by politeness. "You have a beautiful property from what I've heard," Ruby said finally. "I look forward to seeing it at the festival." "It's just land," he replied with a shrug. "Good grazing for cattle, which is what matters in my business. Have you lived in Redemption Creek long? 5 years. Built the ranch from scratch." There was quiet pride in his voice, the first hint of genuine emotion she'd heard from him. "That's impressive," Ruby said sincerely. "Building something of your own, I mean. That's why I came here, in a way, to build something, a life of my own choosing." Zane studied her with new interest. "Most Eastern women come west following a husband or in search of one. Teaching isn't an easy life out here." "I didn't choose it because it was easy," Ruby replied, a hint of challenge in her tone. "I chose it because it matters. These children deserve a good education, regardless of where they live." A slight smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Fair enough, Miss Sullivan." Before they could continue, a harried-looking woman approached, dragging 2 reluctant boys by their collars. "Miss Sullivan, I'm Margaret Donovan. These are my sons, William and James. They'll be in your class tomorrow, and they have something to say to you." The boys, perhaps 10 and 12, shuffled their feet and stared at the ground. "We're sorry for putting the frog in your desk drawer, madam," the older one mumbled. Ruby blinked in surprise. "I haven't found any frogs in my desk." The younger boy's head shot up. "You haven't checked yet." "But we put it there yesterday when you were James." His mother scolded, while Zane made a sound suspiciously like a suppressed laugh. "I see," Ruby said, maintaining her composure. "Well, gentlemen, since your prank has been confessed before execution, I'll consider this matter closed provided you remove the frog immediately after this reception and promise no more such surprises." The boys looked at each other in confusion, clearly having expected a harsher response. "Yes, madam," they chorused. "And as recompense, you can both arrive 30 minutes early tomorrow to help me prepare the classroom for the day." Their faces fell, but they nodded obediently. "Thank you, Miss Sullivan," Mrs. Donovan said with evident relief. "I assure you, they're good boys at heart, just high-spirited." As the family moved away, Ruby turned back to find Zane watching her with something like respect in his eyes. "Handled that well," he commented. "Most new teachers would have made a scene." "Those boys were testing boundaries, not being malicious," Ruby replied. Besides, I grew up with 3 brothers. It takes more than a frog to rattle me. For the first time, Zane Blackwood smiled, fully a transformation that caught Ruby off guard. The stern, reserved countenance gave way to something warmer, more approachable, with crinkles appearing at the corners of his eyes. I should let you continue meeting parents, he said, the smile fading. Good luck tomorrow, Miss Sullivan. Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. As he walked away, Ruby found herself watching his retreating figure longer than propriety dictated. There was something about Zane Blackwood that intrigued her, a complexity beneath the taciturn exterior that made her wonder what experiences had shaped him. But such thoughts were a distraction she couldn't afford. Tomorrow she would face 20 students of varying ages and abilities, all looking to her for guidance and instruction. That responsibility demanded her full attention. Still, as she continued greeting parents and children, Ruby couldn't help but notice when Zane slipped quietly out of the church hall, declining offers of coffee and cake in favor of returning to his solitary ranch. The first week of school passed in a whirlwind of activity. Ruby quickly discovered that teaching in a one-room schoolhouse required different skills than those she had developed in Boston's more structured educational environment. Here, she had to simultaneously engage students across multiple grade levels, challenging the advanced learners while supporting those who struggled. The Donovan boys, despite their initial prank, proved to be among her brightest students. Young James had a natural aptitude for mathematics, while William revealed a surprising talent for expressive reading when called upon to recite passages from Robinson Crusoe. By Friday afternoon, Ruby was exhausted but satisfied with the progress they had made. As she dismissed the children for the weekend, she reminded them of their assignments and waved away their groans with good-natured firmness. Miss Sullivan. A shy voice stopped her as she began erasing the chalkboard. She turned to find Sarah Peterson, one of her older students, lingering by her desk. Yes, Sarah. Pa wanted me to invite you to Sunday dinner at our ranch. He says it's a proper thank you for teaching me about fractions. I've been helping him with the accounts, and he says I'm doing it right now. Ruby smiled at the girl's evident pride. That's wonderful, Sarah, and I'd be delighted to accept the invitation. Please thank your father for me. He'll send the wagon for you after church, Sarah said, beaming. Our ranch isn't far, just past Mr. Blackwood's property. As Sarah skipped away, Ruby found herself intrigued by the prospect of seeing more of the surrounding countryside. Her experience of Wyoming Territory thus far had been limited to the town itself and her brief daily walks. Sunday arrived clear and cool. After church services, Ruby found herself being helped into the Petersons' wagon by a weathered man in his 40s who introduced himself as Martin Peterson. Appreciate you coming, Miss Sullivan, he said as he flicked the reins to start the horses. Sarah's been talking about nothing but school all week. Haven't seen her this excited about learning in a long while. Sarah is a bright girl, Ruby replied sincerely. She has a natural gift for mathematics that should be encouraged. The wagon rumbled out of town, following a well-traveled road that wound through rolling grassland. As they crested a small rise, Ruby caught her breath at the vista spread before them, miles of open range framed by distant mountains, their peaks still snow-capped despite the advancing spring. Beautiful, isn't it? Peterson commented, noting her reaction. That's Blackwood land. You're looking at some of the best grazing in the territory. His place is just over that ridge there. Ruby followed his gesture to where a cluster of buildings was visible in the distance, a substantial ranch house, a large barn, and various outbuildings, all well-maintained. Does Mr. Blackwood manage all that himself? Has a foreman and about a dozen hands, depending on the season. But Zane's not one to sit back and give orders. Works alongside his men from dawn to dusk most days. There was respect in Peterson's tone. Started with next to nothing, that one. Bought 100 acres of played-out land nobody wanted and turned it around through sheer stubbornness. Now he's got the most successful operation in the county. He seems, Solitary, Ruby observed carefully. Peterson glanced at her with shrewd assessment. Zane Blackwood keeps his own counsel, that's certain. Lost his family young father killed by rustlers, mother died soon after. Was raised by an uncle who worked him hard and showed little kindness. Teaches a man to rely on himself, that kind of upbringing. The wagon turned away from the view of the Double B, following a smaller track toward the Peterson ranch, a more modest but equally well-kept operation. Sarah ran out to greet them, excited to show Ruby the calf that had been born just that morning. The afternoon passed pleasantly. Mrs. Peterson proved to be an excellent cook, and the family was genuinely welcoming. After dinner, Sarah proudly showed Ruby her small collection of books, including a tattered copy of Little Women that had been her mother's. "Would you like to borrow any of my books?" Ruby offered. "I brought quite a few with me from Boston." Sarah's eyes widened. "Could I really?" "Of course. That's what books are for, to be read and shared." As the sun began its descent, Mr. Peterson hitched up the wagon to take Ruby back to town. Their route took them past the Double B again, and Ruby noticed activity in the nearest pasture, several riders moving cattle, with Zane Blackwood's distinctive figure easily identifiable even at a distance. "Working on a Sunday," she remarked. "Cattle don't know it's the Sabbath," Peterson replied with a chuckle. "Looks like they're moving a sick animal. That's not work that can wait." As if sensing their gaze, Zane looked up as they passed. He raised a hand in greeting, which Peterson returned. "Blackwood's a good neighbor," Peterson commented. "Helped us through a tough winter 2 years back when I broke my leg and couldn't manage. Sent his hands over to help with our herd, wouldn't take a penny for it. Just said I'd do the same for him. That's the way of things out here, we look after each other." Ruby found herself contemplating this new information about Zane. The image of the isolated, standoffish rancher was being gradually complicated by these glimpses of the man beneath the reserved exterior. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm. Ruby's days were filled with teaching, while her evenings were devoted to lesson preparation and correspondence with her family back east. Occasionally, she joined the Wheelers or other townspeople for dinner, gradually becoming integrated into the community's social fabric. She saw Zane Blackwood infrequently, a distant figure on horseback, when he came to town for supplies or council meetings. He attended church sporadically, always sitting at the back and departing immediately after the service, avoiding the social gathering that followed. As the spring festival approached, Ruby worked with her students on their contribution, a series of recitations and a short play based on American history. The children were enthusiastic, especially when she explained they would be performing outdoors at Mr. Blackwood's ranch. "Have you been to his ranch, Miss Sullivan?" young Emily Miller asked during a rehearsal. "No, I haven't had the pleasure," Ruby replied. "It's real pretty," the girl continued. "Has a creek with fish and everything. Pa says Mr. Blackwood's the richest man in the county, but he lives all alone in that big house." "Emily," Ruby gently admonished, "it's not polite to discuss Mr. Blackwood's personal affairs. But don't you think it's sad? My ma says he needs a wife, but he's too stubborn to court anybody." "That's enough, Emily. Let's continue with your lines." Despite her outward composure, Ruby found herself reflecting on the child's innocent observations. There was something poignant about the image of Zane alone in his big house, surrounded by prosperity but lacking companionship. Not that it was any of her concern, she reminded herself firmly. Her purpose in Redemption Creek was to teach, not to involve herself in the personal life of a man who clearly valued his privacy. The day before the festival, Ruby was surprised by a knock at the schoolhouse door just as she was dismissing her students. The children fell silent as Zane Blackwood's tall figure filled the doorway. "Mr. Blackwood," Ruby greeted him, conscious of 20 pairs of curious eyes watching the exchange. "Miss Sullivan." He removed his hat, revealing hair tousled by the wind. "I was in town picking up supplies and thought I should check if you need anything for tomorrow's performances." "Mayor Harrison mentioned you're planning something with the students," That's thoughtful of you. We'll need a clear space for the children to perform, preferably with some shade for the audience. The oak grove by the creek would suit, he said. Natural amphitheater of sorts. I'll have my men set up some benches. Perfect, thank you. An awkward silence fell, broken by a suppressed giggle from one of the younger children. Well, I won't keep you, Zane said, settling his hat back on his head. Until tomorrow, Miss Sullivan, Mr. Blackwood, she nodded, ignoring the speculative looks exchanged among her older students. After he left, Ruby clapped her hands to regain the children's attention. Remember to arrive promptly at 9 tomorrow. The wagon will be waiting outside the general store to transport us to Mr. Blackwood's ranch. As the children filed out, chattering excitedly about the festival, Ruby began gathering her materials. She was surprised to find Sarah Peterson lingering behind. Miss Sullivan, the girl began hesitantly. Can I ask you something? Of course, Sarah. Do you like Mr. Blackwood? Ruby felt heat rise to her cheeks. Mr. Blackwood is a respected member of the community. Why do you ask? Sarah shrugged. Just wondering. Pa says he's never seen Mr. Blackwood make a special trip to town just to check on festival arrangements before. Says he usually just tells Mayor Harrison what to do and leaves it at that. I'm sure Mr. Blackwood was simply being thorough, Ruby replied, keeping her tone neutral. Now run along home. You'll want to be well rested for tomorrow's performance. After Sarah left, Ruby sat at her desk, troubled by the girl's observation. Was it possible Zane had come specifically to see her? And if so, what did that mean? She shook her head, dismissing the thought. More likely, he had simply been fulfilling his responsibilities as host of the event. Reading anything more into the visit was pure fancy, the kind of romantic notion she cautioned her female students against. Still, as she prepared for the festival the next day, Ruby found herself taking extra care with her appearance, selecting her newest dress, a becoming shade of green that complemented her auburn hair, and arranging her hair in a style more elaborate than her usual practical knot. It means nothing, she told herself firmly as she pinned the final strand in place. I simply want to present a respectable appearance as the town's teacher, but the flutter in her stomach as she joined her students in the wagon suggested otherwise. The Double B Ranch exceeded Ruby's expectations. As the wagon approached along a well-maintained road, she caught her first close view of Zane's home, a substantial two-story structure built of native stone and timber, with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. Unlike many frontier homes, it showed evidence of careful design and craftsmanship, with proportions that were both practical and pleasing to the eye. Surrounding the main house were the expected outbuildings of a working ranch, a large barn, bunkhouse, smokehouse, and various sheds and corrals. Everything was meticulously maintained, the fences straight and sturdy, the buildings freshly painted. The festival grounds had been prepared in a meadow beside a clear running creek, just as Zane had described. Oak trees provided welcome shade, and rough benches had been arranged in a semicircle facing a small raised platform that would serve as a stage for the children's performances. Already the area was busy with activity as townspeople and ranching families arrived, bearing food for the communal meal that would follow the morning's entertainment. Tables had been set up beneath the trees, gradually filling with covered dishes, while a separate area had been designated for games and contests. Ruby marshaled her students toward the makeshift stage, helping them arrange their costumes and reviewing their parts one final time. She was so absorbed in preparations that she didn't notice Zane's approach until he spoke. Everything to your satisfaction, Miss Sullivan? She turned, momentarily startled, and found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher, something between amusement and admiration. Yes, thank you, it's perfect, she gestured toward the platform. Did you build this yourself? My men did, following my instructions. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. I want to thank you for preparing the children's performance. It means a lot to the parents. It's my pleasure. The children have worked very hard. Another pause, longer this time. Zane shifted his weight slightly as if uncomfortable. "You look very nice today, Miss Sullivan." The compliment, delivered so stiffly, brought a flush to Ruby's cheeks. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood." Before either could say more, Mayor Harrison approached, clapping his hands for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, if you'll take your seats, we're ready to begin the day's festivities with a performance by our schoolchildren, under the direction of Miss Sullivan." Zane nodded to Ruby and moved away to join the audience. She watched him go, noting how he chose a seat slightly apart from the main crowd, though several people greeted him warmly as he passed. The children's performance went smoothly, with only minor forgotten lines and one near disaster, when young Timothy Johnson's enthusiastic portrayal of George Washington crossing the Delaware nearly toppled the platform. The audience responded with enthusiastic applause, and Ruby felt a surge of pride in her student's accomplishment. As the children took their bows, Ruby glanced toward Zane. He was watching not the stage but her, his expression thoughtful. When their eyes met, he offered a small nod of approval that felt, inexplicably, more significant than the audience's generous applause. The remainder of the day passed in a whirl of activity. After the performances came the community meal, followed by various games and contests for both children and adults. Ruby found herself drawn into the festivities, cheering on her students in sack races and egg and spoon relays, and even participating in a women's horseshoe pitching contest, which she lost spectacularly to Mrs. Donovan, much to the delight of the Donovan boys. Throughout the day, she was aware of Zane moving among his guests, a conscientious if somewhat reserved host. He seemed most at ease with the children, surprising Ruby by joining a group of boys in an impromptu fishing expedition to the creek, returning triumphantly with several trout that were promptly cleaned and added to the evening cookfire. As twilight approached, lanterns were lit, and a small group of musicians, the blacksmith on fiddle, the telegraph operator with a banjo, and surprisingly, Dr. Wheeler on harmonica, set up for dancing. Wooden planks had been laid to create a dance floor, and soon couples were twirling to lively tunes. Ruby sat with Harriet Wheeler, watching the dancers and enjoying the cooler evening air. "A successful day," Harriet commented. "The children performed beautifully." "You've accomplished wonders in such a short time. They're eager learners," Ruby replied. "I'm fortunate." "And you've made quite an impression on our host," Harriet added with a knowing smile. "Zane Blackwood has asked at least 3 people about you today." Ruby felt her cheeks warm. "I'm sure he was simply being polite. Zane is many things, but polite conversationalist isn't generally one of them. The man speaks when he has something to say, not to fill silence." Harriet paused as the music changed to a slower waltz. "And speaking of our host, here he comes now." Ruby looked up to find Zane approaching their table, his expression uncharacteristically hesitant. "Ladies," he greeted them. "Dr. Wheeler was looking for you, Mrs. Wheeler. Something about driving the Millers home as their wagon broke an axle." "Oh dear," Harriet rose. "Poor Mrs. Miller was worried about getting their youngest back before his bedtime. Thank you for letting me know, Mr. Blackwood." As Harriet departed, Zane remained standing, his hat in his hands. After a moment's silence, he spoke. "Would you care to dance, Miss Sullivan?" The request, so unexpected, momentarily robbed Ruby of speech. Zane Blackwood, who had barely spoken 10 consecutive words to her before today, was asking her to dance. Yes, I would like that," she managed finally. He offered his hand, and Ruby placed hers in it, feeling the calluses that spoke of a lifetime of physical labor. His palm was warm and dry, his grip gentle but secure as he led her to the dance floor. As they took their positions for the waltz, Ruby became acutely aware of their physical proximity. Zane's hand rested lightly at her waist, maintaining a proper distance between them, yet she could feel the warmth of his body, smell the clean scent of soap and leather that clung to him. "I should warn you," she said as they began to move, "I'm not particularly accomplished at dancing." "Neither am I," he replied, the hint of a smile softening his features. "Not much call for it in my line of work." Despite their mutual disclaimers, they moved well together, finding a natural rhythm that carried them smoothly around the makeshift dance floor. Zane led with quiet confidence, guiding rather than directing. "Your ranch is beautiful," Ruby said, breaking the silence between them. "You must be very proud of what you've built here." Something in his expression opened at her words like a door unlocked. "It wasn't easy. Land was cheap enough, but making it profitable took every penny I had and then some. First 2 years I slept in the barn, couldn't afford to build the house until the third cattle drive paid off. Yet you persisted. Didn't have much choice. This land was all I had." He paused, then added more quietly, "All I wanted, really. A place of my own where I made the decisions and answered to no one. Independence is valuable," Ruby agreed, thinking of her own journey to Redemption Creek. "Though sometimes I think we mistake solitude for independence." Zane's steps faltered slightly before resuming their rhythm. "Meaning?" "Just that being independent doesn't necessarily mean being alone. We can choose our connections rather than having them thrust upon us." He studied her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Is that why you came west, to choose your connections?" "Partly," she admitted. "In Boston, my path was predetermined: teach at the local school, live with my mother, eventually become the maiden aunt who helps raise her sister's children. Here I can define my own life." "And have you defined it, I mean?" The question held layers of meaning Ruby wasn't sure she was ready to explore. "I'm in the process," she replied carefully. "Some definitions take time to develop fully." The music ended before Zane could respond, and they separated, the moment of intimacy broken by the resumption of social convention. "Thank you for the dance, Miss Sullivan." "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood." For a heartbeat, it seemed he might say more, but then Mayor Harrison approached, effusive in his praise of the festival's success, and the opportunity was lost. As Ruby joined Harriet and Dr. Wheeler for the drive back to town, she found herself replaying the conversation with Zane, analyzing each word and expression. There had been something in his manner, a tentative reaching out that contradicted his reputation for deliberate isolation. Or perhaps she was reading too much into a simple dance, romanticizing a man who had given no clear indication of interest beyond common courtesy. Either way, Ruby reminded herself, she had come to Redemption Creek to teach, not to lose herself in unfounded speculation about a rancher who might or might not harbor feelings for her. Still, as the wagon rolled back toward town under a canopy of stars, Ruby couldn't help but remember the feeling of Zane's hand at her waist, the earnest intensity of his gaze as they discussed independence and connection. Whatever else might be said of Zane Blackwood, there was depth beneath his reserved exterior, a complexity that called to something in Ruby's own nature. The memory of their dance lingered with Zane long after the last guest had departed, and the Double B had settled into nighttime quiet. Sitting on his porch, a glass of whiskey untouched beside him, he replayed the conversation with Ruby Sullivan, her words echoing in his mind. "Sometimes I think we mistake solitude for independence." The observation had struck uncomfortably close to home. For years, he had defined his success by his self-sufficiency, his ability to build and maintain his ranch without relying on others. He'd told himself his solitary existence was a choice, a necessary condition of the independence he prized. But was it truly independence he'd created, or merely isolation? Zane took a sip of whiskey, letting the liquor burn a path down his throat. Until Ruby's arrival in Redemption Creek, he had been content with his life, or if not content, at least reconciled to it. The ranch consumed his energy and attention, leaving little time for reflection on what might be missing. Now, inexplicably, he found himself aware of the emptiness of his house at day's end, the silence that greeted him when he returned from the range. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine a different future, one that included a woman's laughter, perhaps even children's voices. The direction of his thoughts unsettled him. He had closed off such possibilities long ago, after watching his mother wither away from grief following his father's murder. Love, he had learned early, was a vulnerability a man in his position couldn't afford. Caring too deeply meant risking devastation when the inevitable loss came. Yet Ruby Sullivan had awakened something in him, a yearning he had thought long buried. There was a directness about her, an intelligence and quiet strength that drew him despite his determination to maintain emotional distance. Zane drained his glass and stood, his decision made. Whatever momentary weakness had led him to dance with Miss Sullivan, to reveal more of himself than he had intended, it would not be repeated. His life was here, on the ranch he had built. Hers was in town, teaching the children of Redemption Creek. Their paths might cross occasionally, but he would ensure they remained separate journeys. With that resolution firmly in mind, Zane entered his empty house, closing the door on the starlit night and the dangerous possibilities it had seemed to offer. The weeks following the festival saw Zane deliberately avoiding town except when absolutely necessary for business. When he did venture into Redemption Creek, he timed his visits to avoid school hours, ensuring he wouldn't encounter Ruby by chance. His strategy proved effective, if unsatisfying. May turned to June without a single conversation between them, though he caught glimpses of her occasionally walking with students on a nature expedition, or emerging from the general store with supplies. Each sighting left him with a peculiar hollow feeling, as if he'd denied himself something essential. But he pushed the sensation aside, focusing instead on the demanding work of running his ranch. June brought the first signs of summer drought, with pastures beginning to brown and the creek running lower than usual. Zane found himself working from dawn until well after dusk, moving cattle to fresher grazing and ensuring water supplies remained adequate. The physical exhaustion was welcome, leaving little energy for introspection. Then came the fire. It began innocuously enough, a lightning strike in the dry foothills west of town. But driven by hot winds, it quickly spread, consuming the parched grassland with frightening speed. Zane was checking fence lines in his eastern pasture when he saw the smoke on the horizon. Within hours, the fire had become a serious threat to both his ranch and the town beyond. He immediately ordered his hands to begin clearing fire breaks, while dispatching his foreman to Redemption Creek to warn of the danger. The entire community mobilized. Men from town joined ranchers and their workers in fighting the blaze, while women prepared food and medical supplies for the firefighters. Children filled buckets from wells and streams, forming human chains to deliver water where it was needed most. Ruby found herself organizing the schoolchildren into teams, assigning each group specific tasks appropriate to their ages and abilities. The older boys joined the bucket brigades, while younger children helped gather wet blankets and burlap sacks for beating out sparks. As night fell, the fire's glow dominated the western sky, casting an eerie orange light over Redemption Creek. The wind had mercifully shifted, pushing the main blaze away from town, but spot fires continued to threaten outlying properties. Ruby was distributing water to exhausted firefighters when Sheriff Jenkins approached, his face blackened with soot. "Miss Sullivan, I need your help. The Donovan place is directly in the fire's path. We've evacuated the family to town, but Mrs. Donovan is beside herself, says her youngest daughter's rag doll was left behind, and the girl won't stop crying." "Surely no one's thinking of going back for a doll?" Ruby asked, alarmed. "No, but we need someone to care for the Donovan children while their parents help with the firefighting. They're at the church hall with other evacuated families. Could you go?" "Of course." The church hall was chaotic, children crying for parents, elderly people huddled on makeshift pallets, volunteers attempting to distribute food and blankets. Ruby quickly located the Donovan family, the two boys she knew from school and their younger sister, a girl of about 4 who was indeed inconsolable over her lost doll. "Hello, Emily," Ruby greeted the little girl, kneeling to her level. "My name is Miss Sullivan. I teach your brothers at school." The child regarded her with tear-filled eyes but didn't respond. "I understand you had to leave your doll behind. That must be very frightening for both of you." A small nod. "What's your doll's name?" "Molly," came the whispered reply. "Well, I'm sure Molly is waiting for you to come home. In the meantime, would you like to help me take care of some of the younger children? They're scared too, and a brave girl like you could help them feel better." Gradually, Ruby coaxed Emily into helping distribute cups of milk and cookies to smaller children, the activity providing distraction from her own distress. The Donovan boys, eager to be useful, were enlisted to organize games for the younger evacuees. Hours passed as the community waited anxiously for news from the fire line. Occasional messengers brought updates the main blaze had been contained in certain areas but continued to threaten others. No lives had been lost, though several men had suffered burns and smoke inhalation. Just after midnight, a commotion at the church hall entrance drew Ruby's attention. Zane Blackwood stood in the doorway, his clothing singed and his face streaked with soot. He scanned the room with obvious purpose, his gaze finally settling on Ruby. As he approached, she noted his exhausted appearance, the reddened eyes, the way he favored his right arm. "Mr. Blackwood," she greeted him. "Are you injured?" "Nothing serious." He dismissed her concern with a gesture. "Miss Sullivan, I need to speak with you privately." Puzzled, Ruby followed him outside. The night air was still heavy with smoke, but the fierce orange glow had diminished somewhat, suggesting progress in the firefighting efforts. "What is it?" she asked when they were alone. Zane reached into his jacket and carefully withdrew something wrapped in his bandana. Unfolding the cloth, he revealed a somewhat scorched but recognizable rag doll. "Found this at the Donovan place while we were fighting the fire there," he explained. Sheriff Jenkins mentioned the little girl was upset about leaving it behind. Ruby stared at him in astonishment. "You went into a burning building for a child's doll." "Wasn't burning when I went in," he said with a shrug. "Just smoky. Figured it would mean something to the kid." The casual dismissal of his act of kindness touched Ruby deeply. This man, who cultivated a reputation for emotional detachment, had risked himself to retrieve a child's beloved toy. "That was remarkably thoughtful of you, Mr. Blackwood." He shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. "Not really. Just happened to be there." "Nevertheless, Emily will be overjoyed." Ruby reached for the doll, her fingers brushing against his as she took it. The brief contact sent an unexpected warmth through her that had nothing to do with the nearby fires. "Thank you," she said softly. Zane nodded, his eyes meeting hers for a moment before looking away. "I should get back. Fires mostly contained, but we're still watching for flare-ups." "Be careful," Ruby said impulsively, touching his arm, "and come back safely." Something flickered in his expression, surprise, perhaps, or a deeper emotion she couldn't name. Then he nodded again and turned away, striding back toward the orange glow on the horizon. Ruby watched him go, the doll clutched in her hands, aware of a shift in her perception of Zane Blackwood. The gesture revealed a compassion at odds with his carefully maintained facade of self-sufficiency. What other depths might lie beneath that reserved exterior? She returned to the church hall, where Emily Donovan's joy at being reunited with her doll provided a moment of brightness in the long, anxious night. But as Ruby comforted frightened children and distributed blankets to exhausted evacuees, her thoughts repeatedly returned to Zane and the brief, telling interaction outside the church. The fire was finally contained 2 days later, after burning thousands of acres of rangeland but miraculously sparing most buildings. The Double B had lost some fencing and a small hay barn, but Zane counted himself fortunate compared to some neighboring ranchers who had suffered more substantial damage. In the fire's aftermath, the community pulled together to rebuild what had been lost. Barn raisings and fence mending parties became regular weekend activities. with families traveling from miles around to help those most affected. Ruby found herself drawn into these efforts, organizing the schoolchildren to write thank-you letters to firefighters and collect supplies for families who had lost homes. The school term had officially ended, but many children continued to gather at the schoolhouse for these projects, grateful for purposeful activity during the unsettling time. It was during one such gathering, nearly 2 weeks after the fire, that Zane appeared at the schoolhouse door. The children fell silent at his entrance, regarding the tall rancher with a mixture of awe and curiosity. "Mr. Blackwood," Ruby greeted him, hiding her surprise. "What brings you to town?" "Delivering lumber for the Wilsons' new barn," he explained, removing his hat. "Saw the children here and—" He hesitated, then reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a package wrapped in brown paper. "Brought something that might be useful for your projects." Ruby accepted the package, unwrapping it to reveal several skeins of colorful yarn and a set of knitting needles. "Mrs. Carson at the general store mentioned you were teaching the girls to knit blanket squares for families who lost bedding in the fire," he explained, seeming almost embarrassed. "Thought these might help." "How thoughtful," Ruby said warmly. "Girls, what do we say to Mr. Blackwood?" "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood," they chorused. Zane nodded awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable with their attention. "Well, I should get back to the lumber delivery." "Actually," Ruby said impulsively, "we were just about to have lemonade and cookies. The children made the cookies themselves yesterday. Would you join us?" He hesitated, and Ruby was certain he would decline. Then, to her surprise, he nodded. For a few minutes, maybe. What followed was a revelation. The children, initially shy around the imposing rancher, gradually warmed to him as he answered their questions about the fire and his cattle. When young James Donovan asked about becoming a rancher someday, Zane responded with unexpected patience, explaining the various skills required and the challenges involved. Ruby watched, fascinated, as the man she had perceived as taciturn and reserved engaged with her students with genuine interest and surprising gentleness. He was particularly good with the younger boys, answering their endless questions without condescension. "You're very good with children," she commented as he prepared to leave, nearly an hour after his intended few minutes. Zane looked startled by the observation. "Never spent much time around them before, but they're straightforward, say what they mean. I appreciate that." "They're also excellent judges of character," Ruby replied with a smile. "They've clearly decided you're worthy of their trust." He glanced away, seemingly uncomfortable with the implied compliment. "I should go. Thank you for the lemonade, Miss Sullivan. Thank you for the yarn, Mr. Blackwood." It was very thoughtful. As he settled his hat back on his head, Zane paused as if considering something. "Miss Sullivan, Ruby, would you consider riding out to the ranch on Saturday? There's a—" He stopped, then continued with more determination. "There's a spot by the creek I think you might enjoy seeing. Good place for a picnic, maybe." The invitation, so unexpected, momentarily robbed Ruby of speech. Was Zane Blackwood asking to court her? "That sounds lovely," she managed finally. "What time should I be ready?" "I'll come for you at 10 if that suits." "It does." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Until Saturday, then." After he left, Ruby turned to find her older female students watching her with undisguised interest. "Is Mr. Blackwood courting you, Miss Sullivan?" Sarah Peterson asked boldly. "That's not an appropriate question, Sarah," Ruby replied, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. "My ma says he's sweet on you," Emily Miller added. "Says she saw how he looked at you at the festival." "That's enough, girls. Let's get back to our knitting." But as she helped the children with their blanket squares, Ruby couldn't suppress the flutter of anticipation in her stomach. Saturday suddenly seemed very far away. The appointed day dawned clear and warm. Ruby dressed with particular care, selecting a lavender dress that was practical enough for a countryside excursion yet flattering to her coloring. She arranged her hair in a simple but becoming style, secured with tortoiseshell combs that had been her grandmother's. Zane arrived precisely at 10, driving a well-maintained buggy rather than riding horseback as was his usual custom. He too had made an effort with his appearance, wearing a clean shirt and jacket, his dark hair neatly trimmed. "You look lovely," he said as he helped her into the buggy, the compliment delivered with a directness that made it all the more affecting. "Thank you. You look very nice yourself." The drive to the Double B took them through rolling countryside now beginning to recover from the fire. Fresh green shoots were emerging from the blackened earth, a testament to nature's resilience. "It's coming back quickly," Ruby observed, gesturing to the new growth. "Fire's part of the natural cycle out here," Zane replied. "Clears out the old, makes way for new life." Native tribes used to set controlled burns deliberately kept the grass healthy for the buffalo. As they approached the ranch, Ruby had her first opportunity to view the main house up close. Built of locally quarried stone with a wide porch spanning its front, it managed to be both substantial and welcoming. "You designed this yourself?" she asked as Zane helped her down from the buggy. "Had help from a fellow who'd worked as a carpenter back east," he admitted. "But the basic layout was my idea. Wanted something that would last, not just a temporary shelter." "It's beautiful," Ruby said sincerely. "You've created something remarkable here." Something in Zane's expression softened at her words. "Thank you, that means." "Well, it means something, coming from you." He led her around the house to where a path descended gently toward the creek that gave the Double B its name. They followed the watercourse for perhaps a quarter-mile, then rounded a bend to reveal a grove of cottonwoods surrounding a small pool where the creek widened and deepened. "This is my favorite spot on the property," Zane said, gesturing to the idyllic scene. "Found it the first day I rode this land before I'd even decided to buy. Somehow knew then that this place could be home." Ruby understood his attachment immediately. The location was naturally beautiful, the water clear and inviting, the trees providing dappled shade, wildflowers dotting the grassy bank. "It's lovely," she said softly. "So peaceful. Thought we could have our picnic here if it suits you." "It's perfect." Zane spread a blanket beneath the largest cottonwood and produced a surprisingly elaborate picnic from the basket he'd carried: fried chicken, biscuits, apple pie, and a jug of cool lemonade. As they ate, their conversation flowed more easily than Ruby would have expected, given Zane's usual reticence. He told her about his early days on the ranch, the backbreaking work of clearing land, digging wells, and building the first crude structures. She shared stories of her childhood in Boston, her decision to become a teacher, and her desire to make a difference in her students' lives. "Why Redemption Creek?" he asked eventually. "Must have been other teaching positions closer to home." Ruby considered the question, wanting to give an honest answer. "I needed space, room to discover who I might become without the weight of others' expectations. Back east, I was defined by my family's position, my father's reputation, the narrow path considered appropriate for a woman of my background. Here, I'm simply Miss Sullivan, the teacher. I can define myself." "Understand that," Zane nodded. "It's partly why I came west too, to build something that was entirely my own, not inherited or given, but earned." "We're not so different then," Ruby observed. Zane's expression grew thoughtful. "Maybe not, though I've been accused of taking independence too far. Turning it into isolation, like you said at the festival. And have you isolated yourself deliberately?" He was silent for a long moment, gazing out at the creek. "After my parents died, I learned it was safer not to need people. Can't lose what you don't have." The simple statement, delivered without self-pity, touched Ruby deeply. "But that's a half-life, isn't it? Protecting yourself from loss by foregoing connection altogether? Maybe." Zane turned to look at her directly, his expression more open than she had ever seen it. "Been thinking about that lately, wondering if the price of that kind of safety might be too high." The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken possibilities. Then, with deliberate care, Zane reached across the blanket and took Ruby's hand in his. "Ruby Sullivan, I'm not good with fancy words or courtship, but I find myself thinking about you when you're not there. wondering what you'd say about things I see or do, looking forward to the times I might run into you in town." He paused, his thumb tracing a gentle pattern on her palm. "I'd like permission to call on you properly, to see where this connection between us might lead." Ruby felt a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the summer sun. "I'd like that very much, Zane." His smile, rare, genuine, and transformative, made her breath catch. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to withdraw, Zane leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that was both gentle and purposeful. Ruby responded with a matching tenderness, her free hand coming up to rest against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heart beneath her palm. When they separated, Zane's expression held a mixture of wonder and certainty. "Been telling myself for weeks that this couldn't happen, that a woman like you wouldn't be interested in a rough rancher like me. And I've been telling myself a man like you wouldn't notice a plain schoolteacher," Ruby admitted with a small laugh. "Plain?" Zane looked genuinely puzzled. "Ruby, you're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen. Not just your appearance, though that certainly caught my attention from the first, but the way you are with the children, the way you think, the courage it took to come west alone. There's nothing plain about you." The remainder of their picnic passed in a haze of shared confidences and occasional touches, hands brushing as they reached for the same biscuit, shoulders touching as they sat side by side watching the creek's gentle flow. By the time they reluctantly packed up to return to town, something fundamental had shifted between them. As Zane helped Ruby back into the buggy, he paused, his hands lingering at her waist slightly longer than necessary. "Would you come to dinner next Friday? Meet my foreman and his wife. They live in a cabin on the property. Ellen's a fine cook, and they're good people." "I'd be delighted," Ruby replied, recognizing the significance of the invitation. Zane was bringing her into his world, introducing her to the people who mattered in his life. The drive back to town passed quickly, filled with conversation that ranged from books they had read to plans for the fall cattle drive. When they reached Ruby's cottage, Zane escorted her to the door with a formality that made her smile. "Thank you for a wonderful day," she said as they stood on her small porch. "First of many, I hope," he replied, his voice low and sincere. This time it was Ruby who initiated the kiss, rising on tiptoe to press her lips to his. Zane's arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer as the kiss deepened, expressing without words the connection that had grown between them. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Zane brushed a strand of hair from Ruby's face with a tenderness that made her heart ache. "Until Friday," he said softly. "Until Friday," she echoed, watching as he returned to the buggy and drove away, raising his hand in farewell as he turned onto the main road. As Ruby entered her cottage, she was struck by how different it felt from when she had left that morning. Nothing had physically changed, yet everything seemed transformed by the day's events. For the first time since arriving in Redemption Creek, she felt not just purposeful but truly at home. The summer unfolded in a series of increasingly precious moments. Zane's courtship of Ruby proceeded with the same quiet determination that characterized his approach to everything that mattered to him. Their Friday dinner with his foreman, Frank Mitchell, and Frank's wife, Ellen, evolved into a weekly tradition, with Ruby often arriving early to help Ellen prepare the meal while the men finished the day's work. Ellen, a no-nonsense woman in her 40s who had lived on the frontier most of her life, quickly became both mentor and friend to Ruby. Under her guidance, Ruby learned skills not taught in Boston finishing schools: how to make soap from rendered fat and lye, preserve vegetables for winter, and treat common ailments with herbs and poultices. "Never thought I'd see Zane Blackwood smitten," Ellen remarked one Friday afternoon as they prepared dough for biscuits. "Man's been locked up tighter than a drum since I've known him. Then you come along and suddenly he's smiling for no reason, bringing wildflowers back from the range." Ruby felt a blush warm her cheeks. "He's a good man. I think he just needed someone to recognize that." Ellen nodded approvingly. You see him clear, that's certain, and he sees you the same way. It's a rare thing, that kind of seeing. In town, Ruby's relationship with Zane became a subject of benevolent gossip. The sight of the reserved rancher escorting the schoolteacher to church each Sunday, or the two of them sharing ice cream on the hotel veranda on warm evenings, provided the community with a real-life romance more compelling than any dime novel. "Never seen Blackwood look so alive," Sheriff Jenkins commented to Dr. Wheeler as they watched Zane and Ruby emerge from the general store, deep in conversation. "Man's finally found something that matters more than cattle and land." When Zane formally proposed in late August, beneath the cottonwood tree where they had shared their first kiss, no one in Redemption Creek expressed surprise. The engagement announcement in the local newspaper merited only a small paragraph, but the community's response was overwhelming. Gifts appeared on Ruby's doorstep daily, from hand-stitched quilts to preserved fruits, to offers of help with wedding preparations. They were married on a perfect September day, with the aspens just beginning to turn gold against the evergreen slopes of the surrounding mountains. The ceremony, held in Redemption Creek's small church, was attended by virtually the entire community. Ruby wore a dress of ivory silk ordered specially from Denver, while Zane cut a striking figure in a new black suit that made him look, according to a sighing Sarah Peterson, like a hero from a storybook. The reception, held at the Double B Ranch, transformed the working cattle operation into a celebration venue. Tables laden with food stretched beneath the cottonwoods by the creek, while a dance floor had been constructed on the level ground nearby. Children ran laughing through the meadow, playing games organized by Ruby's former students, while adults gathered in groups to eat, drink, and share in the couple's happiness. As evening approached, Zane led Ruby away from the festivities, following the now familiar path to their special spot by the creek. The setting sun gilded the water, casting long shadows from the cottonwoods across the grassy bank. "Happy, Mrs. Blackwood?" he asked, his arms encircling her waist from behind as they gazed at the peaceful scene. "Completely," Ruby replied, leaning back against his chest. "Though I'm still getting used to my new name." "Suits you," Zane murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Ruby Blackwood, my wife." She turned in his arms to face him, struck anew by the transformation in his expression. The guarded look that had once been his default had given way to an open warmth when they were alone together, a vulnerability he no longer felt the need to conceal. "I love you, Zane Blackwood," she said softly, "more than I ever thought possible. And I love you." His voice held a hint of wonder, as if he still couldn't quite believe his good fortune. "Never thought I'd say those words to anyone, didn't think I had it in me after everything. But you showed me different, showed me I was capable of more than just surviving." "We both were," Ruby replied, thinking of her constrained life in Boston. "We just needed the right person to help us see it." Their kiss, tender and unhurried, sealed the promise between them not just of love, but of growth, of becoming more together than either could be alone. As they returned to their wedding celebration hand in hand, Ruby reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had come to Redemption Creek seeking independence, a chance to define herself on her own terms. Instead, she had found connection with her students, with the community, and most profoundly, with the man beside her. And in that connection, paradoxically, she had discovered her truest self. 5 years later, Ruby sat on the wide front porch of the Double B Ranch house, a leather-bound book open in her lap and a cup of coffee cooling on the table beside her. The early morning air was crisp with the promise of autumn, the distant mountains already dusted with the season's first snow. From inside the house came the sound of childish laughter, followed by Zane's deeper voice recounting what was clearly an amusing story. Ruby smiled, picturing the scene, their 4-year-old daughter Emma perched on her father's knee while 2-year-old Thomas attempted to climb up his back, both children captivated by whatever tale their father was spinning. The sound of hoofbeats drew her attention to the road where a rider approached at an unhurried pace. Recognizing Frank Mitchell returning from his morning inspection of the herd, Ruby waved a greeting. "Morning, Mrs. Blackwood," Frank called as he dismounted. "Fine day. Indeed it is. Coffee's hot if you'd like some." "Wouldn't say no. Where's the boss?" Inside with the children, they cornered him for a story before breakfast. Frank chuckled as he poured himself coffee from the pot Ruby had brought out earlier. "Never thought I'd see the day when Zane Blackwood would rather tell stories to little ones than check on his cattle." "Life is full of surprises," Ruby agreed with a smile. The Double B had prospered over the past 5 years, expanding to nearly 1,000 acres with a reputation for producing some of the finest beef cattle in the territory. But the greatest transformation had been in its owner. The solitary, reserved man Ruby had first encountered had gradually given way to a husband and father, who approached these roles with the same dedication and integrity he brought to his work. He still had moments of quiet introspection, times when the weight of responsibility seemed heavy on his shoulders, but he no longer carried that burden alone. The door opened, and Zane emerged with Thomas riding his shoulders and Emma skipping alongside, chattering about the story they'd just heard. "Frank," Zane nodded a greeting. "Everything all right with the North herd? Fine as can be. Calves are growing strong." That new bull was worth every penny. As the men discussed ranch business, Ruby helped Emma settle with her picture book while Thomas clambered down from his father's shoulders to investigate a grasshopper on the porch steps. Watching her family, Zane gesturing as he described plans for the new corral, Emma's copper curls catching the morning light, Thomas's determined concentration on the insect that had captured his attention, Ruby felt a profound contentment. Their life wasn't without challenges. Ranching remained a precarious occupation, subject to the whims of weather, markets, and occasionally human malice. Just last winter, they had faced a devastating blizzard that had claimed several prized animals despite their best efforts to protect the herd. But they faced each challenge together, their partnership strengthened by shared purpose and mutual respect. And in the process, they had created something neither had fully believed possible: a home filled with love, laughter, and the messy, wonderful complexity of family life. As if sensing her thoughts, Zane looked up from his conversation with Frank, his eyes meeting hers across the porch. The smile they exchanged held years of shared experience, the joy of their children's births, the pride of building their ranch into a legacy for those children, the quiet intimacy of evenings spent planning and dreaming together. Later that evening, after the children were asleep and the day's work complete, Zane and Ruby sat together on the porch swing, watching as stars appeared in the darkening sky. His arm rested comfortably around her shoulders, her head leaning against his chest. "Got a letter from my sister today," Ruby mentioned, breaking the companionable silence. "She and John are considering a visit next summer. Says she can hardly believe her spinster sister is now a rancher's wife with 2 children. Zane chuckled. "What would your Boston friends think if they could see you now, churning butter, mending fences, delivering calves in the middle of the night?" "They'd be scandalized," Ruby replied with a laugh, "and terribly envious. No regrets, then, about leaving civilization behind." The question, though lightly posed, held echoes of an old insecurity, Zane's occasional worry that Ruby might someday miss the refinements and comforts of Eastern life. Ruby shifted to look up at him, her expression serious. "I didn't leave civilization behind, Zane. I found it here in this community, in our home, in the life we've built together. This is where I belong, with you and our children. I've never been more certain of anything." Zane's arms tightened around her, his kiss a wordless affirmation of shared conviction. When they separated, his eyes held the depth of feeling that still sometimes surprised him, the love he had once believed impossible for a man with his history and temperament. "I used to think happiness was a luxury I couldn't afford," he said quietly. "Something that made a man vulnerable, weak. Then you came along and showed me it was strength the kind that makes everything else possible. Ruby reached up to trace the lines of his face, no longer the product of solitary worry, but now as often the result of laughter and smiles. We showed each other, I think. And we keep showing each other every day. As night deepened around the Double B ranch house, Zane and Ruby Blackwood remained on their porch, two people who had each sought independence and found in their connection to each other something far more valuable: the freedom to become their truest selves together. In the years that followed, Redemption Creek would grow and change, as frontier towns inevitably did. The railroad would arrive, bringing new opportunities and challenges. The school where Ruby had first taught would expand into a proper building with multiple classrooms. The Double B Ranch would become one of the most respected cattle operations in the state. But through all these changes, one constant remained: the love story of a solitary rancher who had believed love couldn't be his, and the determined schoolteacher who had shown him it already was. Their story became part of local lore, passed down through generations, a testament to the transformative power of love and the courage it takes to embrace it. And on summer evenings, long after Zane and Ruby had grown old together, their grandchildren and great-grandchildren would gather on that same wide porch, beneath stars unchanged since those first tentative days of courtship, to hear the tale of how their family began with a man who built a ranch, a woman who came west to teach, and the unexpected love that had made them both complete.